right, so let's dive right in. Imagine this. You're a farmer, and your whole life depends on this river, right? Flows right through your property. But there's a twist. It's a shared border and the next state over. They've got other plans for that water. Who settles that showdown?
Sound like a recipe for a legal showdown.
Exactly. It's the Supreme Court stepping in with their legal referee hats on.
And those hats come with some serious power. It's called original jurisdiction. Think of it like what's a good analogy? Like a legal express lane, straight to the top. Only certain cases get to bypass the lower courts and go directly to the Supreme Court. Cases, well, like states going head to head.
So we're talking high-stakes legal drama. And that's exactly what we're diving into today. We're going deep on this power of the Supreme Court, how they handle these interstate disputes. And we've got a fantastic guide for our deep dive today, Interstate Disputes, the Supreme Court's original jurisdiction by Joseph F. Zimmerman.
It's quite a mouthful.
It is, but trust me, the stories inside, they're way more exciting than the title might suggest. But before we get to the exciting stuff, I think it's important to rewind a bit.
Absolutely. You can't understand the solution without understanding the problem.
Exactly. So paint us a picture. What was the scene before the Constitution? I can't imagine the Founding Fathers just were like, you know what, we should all just play nice.
Well, imagine 13 independent countries, each one, very protective of their own turf, their own interests.
A recipe for chaos, if you ask me.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And chaos is what they got. Think endless trade wars, states slapping tariffs on each other's goods, just a mess. And then you've got boundary disputes, not just fences and backyards, but control over valuable resources, land, the works.
So basically, it was like a constant power struggle.
Exactly, a recipe for disaster, really. They realized, eventually, that they couldn't function as a united nation if they couldn't even agree on, well, basic things. Who got to use the river? Who could sell their corn across state lines?
Sounds like a nightmare for everyone involved.
It was a real wake-up call. They needed a way to settle these disputes, peacefully, fairly, or the whole nation, it would just fall apart. And that's where the Supreme Court and this idea of original jurisdiction comes in. They needed a neutral party, someone above it all, to be the final word.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. But even with this power, I mean, the Supreme Court can't be expected to play referee for every little disagreement between states, right? I mean, they'd be in session longer than some of those cases drag on. So how do they decide? How does the Supreme Court decide which cases are, worthy of their time and attention?
They've got a system, a 3-point checklist, actually. First, they have to make sure it's really a state issue, not just individuals or companies hiding behind a state's lawsuit.
So no sneaky workarounds.
Exactly. Think of it as a legal filter. Only the genuine state versus state drama gets through.
Okay, that makes sense. What's the next item on this checklist?
Point number 2, all about jurisdiction. Is this something the court can actually solve legally? Or is it more of a political hot potato that they're better off avoiding?
So no settling arguments over which state has the best barbecue then?
Probably not the best use of their time, no.
All right, last checklist item. What's the final hurdle?
They have to consider if the Supreme Court is the absolute best solution. Sometimes sending the issue back to the states involved, maybe with a little nudge from Congress, is the wiser move.
So the Supreme Court isn't always eager to jump into these interstate battles.
Not at all. They'd much rather the states figure things out themselves, if possible.
Makes sense. Saves everyone time and stress. But where things get really interesting, at least for us legal enthusiasts, is when the court does decide to step in. So, spill the tea. What are some of the more, shall we say, eyebrow-raising disputes they've tackled?
Well, you might think it's all state lines and maps when it comes to these disputes.
Seems logical enough.
And you wouldn't be wrong. Boundary disputes are a classic. Take the case of Nebraska v. Iowa, the Missouri River, which, it likes to meander a bit. It actually changed its course, led to a whole legal headache trying to figure out which state owned what.
Talk about a moving target. I can't imagine trying to redraw a state border every time a river decides to take a shortcut. What happened?
Well, the Supreme Court, they basically had to become cartographers, digging into old maps, surveys, you name it. They even had to rely on historical records to figure out where that original boundary was supposed to be. And remember, it wasn't just lines on a map. This was about resources, land ownership, the whole shebang. It gets complicated fast.
Wow, okay. Boundary disputes, I get it. But what about something a little, juicier? What about money?
Money. Now you're speaking my language. Buckle up, because the case of Delaware v. New York, this one involved enough cash to make your head spin. You see, Delaware, it's basically the corporate haven of the U.S. Tons of companies that are incorporated there.
Right. Makes sense.
But here's the thing. A lot of those companies, they do business all over the country. So when they had these unclaimed funds, dividends, uncashed checks, all that, it piled up in Delaware.
So Delaware was sitting on a gold mine of forgotten money. I bet that caused quite a stir.
Oh, you better believe it. Other states, especially New York, they argued that they deserved a cut. After all, if these companies were operating and making money from their residents, shouldn't some of that unclaimed cash stay within their borders?
It's like finding a $20 bill on the sidewalk. Suddenly everyone's got a claim to it. So what did the Supreme Court say? Who gets the loot?
This wasn't just about who got to cash in, though. This case, it forced the Supreme Court to really grapple with some complex questions. We're talking corporate law, residency, those escheatment laws, the ones about abandoned property. It was a whole legal maze.
It sounds like these interstate showdowns, they get complicated fast.
They do, and expensive. Dragging each other to the Supreme Court, it's a bit like a very messy, very public divorce for states. Costly, time-consuming, and nobody really comes out a winner.
So what's the alternative? Do they send each other strongly worded letters, maybe passive-aggressive tweets about state flowers?
Well, there's always that option. But luckily, the Founding Fathers, clever as they were, actually built in a way for states to avoid those legal battles. Interstate compacts.
Hold on, they actually planned for this. What are interstate compacts? Is that some kind of peace treaty?
That's a great way to put it. Think of states as, say, roommates. An interstate compact, that's their agreement on who takes out the trash, right? So they don't end up with a mountain of garbage and hurt feelings.
I like that analogy. Much easier to understand than most legal jargon. So these compacts, they're like pre-conflict contracts, setting the ground rules for how states will handle shared issues, those potential battle zones.
Exactly. And they can cover a huge range of topics, from environmental protection to, you guessed it, how they'll share those precious water resources we talked about. For example, think about the Delaware River Basin.
The Delaware River, that flows through a bunch of states, right? Sounds like a recipe for, a water war.
You'd think so, wouldn't you? But instead of duking it out in court, Delaware, New Jersey, New York, Pennsylvania, they decided to, act like grown-ups. They came together, hammered out this agreement, the Delaware River Basin Compact, an actual plan for how they'd share and manage this vital water source.
So cooperation over courtroom chaos. Color me impressed. Tell me more about how these compacts work. Give me the details.
Let's take the Chesapeake Bay, for instance. Famous for its seafood, its beauty, but it's got its share of problems too, right? Pollution, I'm looking at you.
Yeah, those waters have seen better days.
They have, but here's where those interstate compacts, they really shine. Instead of pointing fingers the states surrounding the bay, they got proactive. Created the Chesapeake Bay Agreement, put a real framework in place to tackle the tough stuff. Pollution, habitat restoration, actually protecting this national treasure.
No, that's what I'm talking about. That's real action, not just talk. It's bigger than just, states not fighting. They're actually addressing these really big issues, things that affect everyone.
Exactly. But, and this is a big but, even with a legally binding agreement and everyone on board, things can still get messy.
Oh, I can only imagine. We are talking about states here. You've got different interests, different politicians, different levels of stubbornness. So what happens when those compacts hit a snag? Who keeps everyone in line?
That's where our friend the Supreme Court steps back in. This time, they're wearing their referee uniforms, not those fancy robes.
Okay, I'm picturing it. Give me a case, a real showdown where the Supreme Court had to crack the whip, so to speak.
Fasten your seatbelts, because we're going way back for this one. Virginia v. Maryland. The year, 1789. The battleground. The one and only Potomac River.
The Potomac. Talk about a river with history. What went down?
Well, Virginia, they were booming, growing fast, needed more water. So naturally, they wanted to build a dam on the Potomac, secure their supply. Maryland, not thrilled. They depended on the river for navigation and trade.
A classic case of different needs, different priorities. Sounds like they needed a referee. Stat.
They did. And since Virginia and Maryland were already at each other's throats, they turned to, you guessed it, the Supreme Court, their last hope for a solution, something that would stick.
So what happened? Did the Supreme Court just pick a side, declare one state the winner, case closed?
This is the Supreme Court, not a boxing match. They did their due diligence, examined historical documents, dug up old treaties, you name it. They even looked at legal precedents, trying to untangle this whole mess. In the end, they ruled in favor of Virginia.
So Maryland just had to suck it up and accept defeat.
Not so fast.
Yeah.
Remember, The Supreme Court, they're all about balance. So yes, they sided with Virginia on the dam, but they also imposed some very specific conditions. Things like how the dam would be built, how it would operate. They had to make sure that Maryland's navigation rights, those wouldn't be jeopardized. It was all about finding that middle ground.
So it was more of a you can have your dam but play nice kind of ruling.
It's a perfect example of how the Supreme Court, when they wade into these interstate disputes, they're not just referees. They're also mediators. They want a solution that works, that benefits everyone, not just the side that, quote unquote, wins.
Makes sense. So we've got Virginia and Maryland, classic history. Got any more modern examples? I'm guessing water disputes are about as American as, I don't know, apple pie and baseball, right?
Oh, you want another water war? Let's head west to the heartland, Kansas v. Colorado. This time, the battle was over the Arkansas River.
The Arkansas River, it's a lifeline for so many communities out there. Drinking water, irrigation, the whole 9 yards. I can definitely see why things would get a little tense.
You're telling me. See, Colorado, they had been, let's just say, generous with their water usage. More and more water from the Arkansas River, using it for irrigation, which you can understand, right? Colorado, it's a pretty dry state.
Yeah.
But Kansas, they weren't too happy about it. They argued that Colorado's water use, it was drying up their farms, their communities, leaving them high and dry, literally.
Another case of upstream versus downstream, huh? Age-old story. So what did the Supreme Court do? Did they just, get out a ruler and divide the river in half?
If only it were that simple. This one, it required a deep dive. The court, they looked at everything. How much water had each state used historically? What were their needs? They even looked at the environmental impact. Would reducing the water flow harm the environment? It was all about finding a solution that was, fair and sustainable. One that wouldn't turn the Arkansas River into a dust bowl.
Talk about pressure. So what happened? What was the verdict?
The Supreme Court did what they do best. They crafted a decree, a kind of water budget for both states. It spelled out exactly how much water each state could draw from the Arkansas River, striking that delicate balance between two states who were essentially sharing a lifeline.
It's fascinating. It really shows how these cases, they go way beyond just legal arguments. We're talking of the real-world impact on people, communities, the environment, the whole picture.
Exactly. And the Supreme Court, they know that. They're acutely aware of that responsibility as they try to navigate these situations, these disputes that are about so much more than just lines on a map.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive, where we're, diving deep into the world of interstate disputes. And of course, the Supreme Court, right, they're always there in the middle, trying to keep those state rivalries in check.
We've seen it all today. Rivers changing course, states battling over unclaimed cash.
It's like a legal treasure hunt. But, for all the talk about boundaries and resources and all that, sometimes the most interesting cases, they go beyond the physical stuff, The real battle, it's over something a bit more intangible.
Absolutely. Sometimes that battle, it's about the very idea of corporate identity.
Okay, corporate identity. That sounds more like a business school lecture than a courtroom drama. Break it down for me. What's the legal battleground there? What are they fighting over?
All right, picture this. The case of Pennsylvania v. New Jersey. New Jersey, they decided to get a little creative, we'll say, with their tax revenue.
Creative how?
They decided, hey, let's tax the income of people who live in Pennsylvania but commute to work in New Jersey.
Ah, so New Jersey wanted a piece of the pie, even if those folks weren't technically residents. Bold move.
Bold indeed. And Pennsylvania, they were not having it. They took their case straight to the Supreme Court, argued that this tax, it went against a fundamental principle, something enshrined in the Constitution, the Privileges and Immunities Clause.
Okay, now, I'm no legal expert, but that sounds pretty serious. What does that clause actually mean? In plain English, please.
It basically means states can't discriminate against people from other states just because they live across, an invisible line.
Makes sense.
Can't create a system where it's better to be a resident of one state versus another, you know what I mean?
Right. So in this case, Pennsylvania was basically saying, hey, New Jersey, you can't punish our residents for, working for a living.
Exactly. And the Supreme Court, they agreed, ruled in favor of Pennsylvania, said that commuter tax was unconstitutional. A win for commuters everywhere.
It's huge, but it's more than just taxes, right? There's a bigger principle at play here.
Absolutely. This case was a huge deal. It was a reminder that, yes, states have the power to tax, but they can't use that power to mess with interstate commerce, to treat people from other states unfairly. We're one nation.
Exactly. United we stand and all that. Okay, that case was fascinating. Got any more legal showdowns up your sleeve?
Well, I've always got more cases. All right, let's shift gears a bit. From commuters and taxes to something a little more, well, combustible. The case of Wyoming v. Oklahoma. This one takes us deep into the energy sector.
Ooh, energy. Always a hot topic, both literally and figuratively. What was the energy battle all about?
Okay, so picture this. Oklahoma, they're known for their oil and gas, right? But they decided to give their coal industry a little boost. Passed a law requiring their electric companies to burn a certain amount of Oklahoma-mined coal.
Okay, makes sense. Support your local businesses, right?
Right.
State pride.
Sure.
Yeah.
But Wyoming, they're another big coal state, and they were not happy. They saw this as Oklahoma trying to muscle in, corner the market, shut out competition from other states. States
Like Wyoming, with their, I'm assuming, very high-quality coal.
Exactly. This wasn't about which state had the better coal, though. It was about something much bigger. It was about the power balance between states and the federal government, specifically when it came to interstate commerce.
Okay, things are heating up. So what happened next? Did Wyoming just sit back and let Oklahoma steal their coal customers?
Not a chance. Wyoming took their case all the way to the Supreme Court. They argued that this Oklahoma law, it violated the Dormant Commerce Clause, which basically means states can't make laws that mess with interstate trade, even if the federal government hasn't specifically said, don't do that.
So even if it's not written down somewhere, there's this understanding that states can't just, build walls and create their own little economic empires.
You got it. And the Supreme Court, in a landmark decision, they sided with Wyoming. Oklahoma's law struck down, sent a very clear message. We're all about free markets here.
That's a big deal.
It was a win for Wyoming, for sure.
Yeah.
But also a reminder to all states that even with the best intentions, you can't just shut out competition from other states. It's all about balance.
These cases, they're fascinating. It really highlights the role of the Supreme Court. They're not just resolving disputes, they're shaping how our system works.
Exactly. It's like they're constantly drawing those lines, those boundaries between state and federal power, one case at a time. And speaking of shaping things, there's one more aspect of these interstate disputes I want to mention. Special masters.
Special masters. Okay, that sounds intriguing. Are we talking about, legal wizards here?
Not quite Hogwarts, no.
Yeah.
But they are pretty special. They're individuals appointed by the Supreme Court to help with those really complex cases. Think of them as expert consultants. They're brought in when you need specialized knowledge, water rights, finances, even historical boundaries, you name it.
So they're the Supreme Court's trusted advisors.
Yeah.
Helping them sort through the really complicated stuff.
That's a great way to put it. They do the nitty-gritty work, gathering evidence, conducting hearings, sometimes even making recommendations to the court. Really important role to play.
Give me an example. When has a special master really made a difference in one of these interstate showdowns?
Let's go back to our water wars for a second. Remember Colorado v. Kansas, the battle over the Arkansas River?
Of course. How could I forget?
Well, the Supreme Court, they brought in a special master for that one, a real water expert. Tasked them with, really digging into both sides' claims. Was Colorado using too much? Was Kansas being dramatic? The special master, they had to look at the science, the history, everything.
So they're like water detectives trying to get to the bottom of this whole water fight.
Exactly. And their findings, they were crucial. They helped the Supreme Court reach a decision that, as you might expect, involved a whole lot of compromise.
It really shows you that there's so much more going on behind the scenes. Before those rulings, those decisions that shape the nation, there's a lot of research, a lot of work.
It's true. It shows you how dedicated the court is to finding real solutions, ones that follow the law, but also, work in the real world.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today. From rivers and boundaries to money and coal, we've explored some of the most fascinating interstate showdowns in American history.
And we've seen how the Supreme Court, those guardians of the Constitution, they're always there, right? Making sure that justice, prevails, even when those disputes get a little messy.
And that's a wrap on today's deep dive into interstate disputes and the power of the Supreme Court.
It's been a pleasure exploring these legal battles with you.
Always a pleasure to have you with us. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this journey. Until next time, keep those legal minds sharp and remember, the pursuit of knowledge, it's always more fun with friends.